Hey guys, Paul Warburg back in Utah today. Very important topic to discuss today. Today I want to take a deep dive and look at some of the differences between the Ukrainian and the Russian militaries. In particular, how each military goes about sourcing soldiers for their conflict. As you'll see throughout this video, there are some very stark and significant differences. And when you start to analyze the reasons behind these differences, you start to form a very clear picture in your mind about the moral standing of each nation when it comes to this conflict. A lot of the differences that I'm going to discuss today just haven't been discussed that much in the popular sphere of people following the war in Ukraine. They've been covered in some depth from the very beginning by different media outlets, but for some reason it hasn't picked up as much at the popular level. And I think that's a shame because they really do reveal a lot. Now, what's stimulating me to have this discussion right now is some data that I shared with my YouTube community last night about the demographics of people who follow this channel. I was recently looking at that data and found something very interesting. When you look at the data of people who watch in-depth analysis of the war in Ukraine and why it's going on and what's actually going on, you notice a pretty huge drop-off in young audiences. In my channel in particular, only about 9% of my audience is under the age of 34, which, if you think about it, is sort of troubling. People under the age of 34, generally speaking, are people who fight in wars. They are the people who, more than anybody else, should have a well-educated and well-formulated opinion on global events before they jump into a conflict that could cost them their life. But unfortunately, it turns out that it's exactly the opposite. Now, as I was thinking about that, that's what caused me to think about why the differences between Ukrainian and Russian recruitment and conscription practices are actually so significant and reveal so much. A lot of people know that the human brain works in a particular way, especially for young men, where our brains are not fully developed until around the age of 25 to 27. Which is when our prefrontal cortex becomes fully attached. For women, that actually happens a couple of years younger. So technically speaking, yes, women, you do mature faster than men. But the reason this is significant is because until the age of 25 through 27, because their brains are not fully developed, literally on a biological level, young men do not have a sufficient capacity for actually perceiving and recognizing and understanding risk and the consequences for their actions. This is what makes young men in particular so crazy, willing to do just crazy things that a lot of times women don't understand, take crazy risks, and also makes young men more susceptible to things like gambling and getting addicted to that than just about any other age bracket. Now, in the context of war, it turns out that this is actually very important. It is well known, of course, that war is the prospect of young men, not older men. And generally speaking, many more young men fight in wars than older men. To the point that many philosophers have, of course, waxed eloquently on how war is basically about sending young men to die for the sake of old men's arguments. And unfortunately, there really is a lot of truth to that. People often think, though, that that is for physical reasons. But the truth is that physical reasons do play a part in things, but that in reality, men generally are healthy enough physically to engage in war through their mid-30s and early 40s. And yet it is usually men that are much younger than that who are drafted and enlisted in militaries. And the reason for that actually has to do with this lack of mental development. young men who do not yet have a fully perceived grasp of risk, it turns out make great soldiers, in particular for certain types of warfare that involve sending lots of young people charging at enemy lines, risking their lives in a very intense way that is very apparent. And it actually turns out that it's quite difficult to get older men whose brains are fully developed to engage in those kinds of tactics because the math just doesn't work for them. That now brings us back to our topic today, which is the difference between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military and how they source their soldiers. Ukraine's conscription standards, what a lot of people don't realize, are actually quite unique, especially for people like myself who are looking at this from a Western point of view. Here in the United States, our conscription age ranges between 18 and 25. Those are the ages that you can be conscripted to join the military, right up to the point where your brain is fully developed. I don't know if that's why they made that the cutoff date, but that is the cutoff date. Where currently in Ukraine, it turns out that it is actually the opposite. In Ukraine, the age that we stop conscripting people in the United States is the age that Ukraine actually starts. You cannot be conscripted and forced to go to war until you are at least the age of 25. And their conscription age will then go up much higher than many of us are used to, currently up to the age of 60. Before the war, Ukraine's conscription ages were 27 through 50, and now it's been adjusted from 25 to 60. And while they do conscript older men, you have to understand that these are usually people who are being put in positions like logistics. They're not being put on the front line. And if they are in areas of the front line that are not as hot, where they try to leverage the younger conscripts to do most of the actual physical fighting. Now, I'll return to analyze Ukraine's conscription age in just a minute and look a little bit more about why the conscription age is what it is, and in particular, why Ukraine has been unwilling to lower it. But first, I want to contrast this with Russia's conscription and recruitment practices. Russia's conscription age, of course, is much different. It is from 18 to 30 years old, although people in Russia have talked about raising it much higher to include older men to serve in rear areas, just like they do in Ukraine. And in particular, Russia has a conscription process where all the time they are taking a certain cohort of men aged 18 years old and putting them through a 12-month mandatory military training program. The reason this is so significant is because it ensures that Russia always has access to a pool of young men that have been trained to think in a military way before their brains have fully developed, so that Russia can use those young men for whatever purposes are necessary, and they always have young men guaranteed to be available to them. A lot of Russia's other recruitment practices are also targeted, of course, more towards young men. And it's not that these practices are exclusive to Russia. I don't want to claim that. I mean, here in the United States, we do a lot of the same things, where Russia tries to make soldiers look like action heroes, and like this is a really cool way, even to get a lot of girls. You will see Russian military recruitment propaganda, specifically with men coming back from the war and girls choosing the soldiers who fought in the war over the cowards who stayed at home and didn't fight. Russia also offers young men lots of money to join the military. And you can see that really the whole Russian recruitment program, in contrast to Ukraine, is optimized into getting as many young men as possible into the system. And it is not appealing to anything logical or really anything even directly related to the conflict itself, but it is really related to young men's visions of themselves and of reality. And so now let's talk about the difference in a practical sense and how it manifests itself on the battlefield when you have armies of different ages like this fighting against each other. And then we'll return and look at why Ukraine does things the way they do. At a practical level, when you look at the battlefield tactics used by Russia and Ukraine, you can see that each of their tactics are optimized around the demographic that exists in their military. Ukraine's military, because it is made up of older men, their tactics are generally more defensive. Their tactics are going to focus on using long-range weapons, like missiles and drones, which of course Russia uses too, but we're talking about degrees and extents here. Whereas Russia, on the other hand, their tactics, they have the famous meat waves, where they will, to take an objective, send just literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of soldiers who keep getting killed to just grind down a Ukrainian defensive position. And the reason that Russia is able to do things the way they do, and Ukraine does things the way they do, actually does, in a sense, come down to demographics and the psychology of the soldiers. I said earlier, it is a lot easier to convince young men who are headstrong to charge at an objective than older men. So that's the background of the differences between Ukraine and Russia's conscription and recruitment practices. Now I want to analyze this a lot more thoroughly. And this is where things can get pretty confusing, because this is an area where spin and the way that things are presented can make a big, big difference. For example, I will often hear Russian trolls and Russian propaganda portraying Ukraine's military recruitment practices in a particular way, where they will obviously frame it as a negative. And this is something that used to unsettle me a little bit, because they will point out how Ukraine is relying on these older men to fight its wars for them. And the implication is that Ukraine just doesn't have enough young men to fight, and they are really just on their last leg. Sort of like in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, when they're fighting in Helm's Deep, and they're at the smith, and all these old men are being given weapons because they're the only men that Rohan has. Now, in turn, those talking points also end up getting picked up, of course, in Western media as well, in particular by media outlets that have a vested interest, typically, in stopping funding for the war in Ukraine, and who want to portray the war as basically a lost cause. But in either case, obviously, we are entering an area where there are lots of different opinions. And these areas can be some of the most frustrating to examine because objective reality gets a little bit harder to grasp. And in the areas, though, where everybody is the most opinionated, often those are the most important areas for us to examine closely, even if we arrive at different answers. So to help us out a little bit in that, I want to introduce a tool I use that will help us see some of this difference in dialogue in real time, and that is ground news. Ground news, what it does is it gathers related articles around the world in one place that cover the same story, so you can compare and contrast how different people talk about the same thing. And with each news outlet, they show context about the source of the information and whether or not there is an identified political bias, who owns them, and more. Today's topic in particular is one where you can see some interesting differences. I've pulled up a topic about how the US has been pushing Ukraine to actually lower its draft age, which I'm going to discuss in detail here. But first, just notice the differences in tone in all these articles. When I hone in on sources that lean towards the right, I find things immediately like how the outgoing Biden regime is urging Ukraine to quickly lower the age of conscription, which of course implies a degree of desperation from the US and has a slightly negative overall connotation. If I look at the left, I find more neutral headlines focusing on how the US has drawn up a plan to resolve manpower shortages in Ukraine. And if I look at the center, things are, again, more neutral. Sometimes you notice some really interesting stuff while doing this. So this is just a source you can use to gut check resources and see other sides. I like to use it. It helps when creating these videos. And quickly, since Ground News is a sponsor of this channel, if you want to check it out for yourself, you can get a big discount on their Vantage plan, which is the one I use to get unlimited access to all the features if you subscribe using my link ground.news/Paul, or you can also scan the QR code on screen. So that in mind, let's discuss now this topic where the US is pressuring Ukraine to actually lower its draft age. And the question is, why? Well, the question we have to ask is, why is Ukraine's draft structured the way it is in the first place? I've already pointed to some systemic differences in the way that Ukraine thinks about war versus the way that Russia thinks about war. And that really is part of this. In Ukrainian culture, when you really research Ukrainian culture, what you realize is that there is a desire for young men to have life experience before they are forced into something as chaotic as war. A lot of that comes from the history of the country. It has a long history of warfare. They were deeply impacted, especially by World War II, and that has really seeped into their roots. And so they want men with more life experience to be fighting their battles for them, not men with less life experience. There's some emotional reasons for that, but there's also some practical reasons for that. There's the emotional side. Everybody should have a chance to have a family and see the world and things like that. But there's also the practical side of where Ukraine prefers actually to take soldiers who are educated, who have skills, who have things to offer, because they want a more professional military, and you can see this in the way that their military is structured, versus Russia, who actually prefers to have soldiers who are younger, right out of high school, more malleable. There is really a difference, if you really think about it, between an 18-year-old right out of high school having their first adult experience, going right into the military and basically thinking, okay, this is what adult life is really like, versus somebody who enters the military, let's say at age 25, who there's a high likelihood that they are already married, may even have a couple of children, in the way that those people think about the world. Somebody right out of high school is going to be very submissive, very much wanting to gain others' approval, very willing to do crazy things like charging at enemy front lines, where somebody who is married and has a family is actually used to being a leader. And they are not going to be as submissive to crazy orders, which could be an advantage or a disadvantage. From Russia's perspective, it's a disadvantage to have men who think for themselves and who make their own decisions and who are going to be resistant to terrible orders. From Ukraine's perspective, it's an advantage. They would rather have people who think strategically, running the show and making the daily decisions even in their military. Now, there is also another aspect to this, which is demographics, not just of the military, but of the respective nations as a whole. Both Russia and Ukraine are countries that were devastated by World War II, which left huge chunks in their population, basically for every generation, that should have come down from the people who died in World War II, who basically should have existed and don't. So their populations are really declining really fast, even without war. And you can see here the difference in approach in actually caring to fix that problem. For Ukraine, they see fixing their demographic problem primarily through giving their men more opportunities to start families, to reproduce before they go to war. For Russia, it's the opposite. A lot of people have commented on how one reason Russia might have wanted to try to take over Ukraine was as a band-aid fix to their demographic problem. It wouldn't have actually fixed the problem, but what it would have done is it would have added Ukraine's large population to Russia's population, which would have made them look larger and more powerful on the world stage and given them a larger tax base and everything like that. And so Russia, basically, you see trying to fix their demographic problem through conquest, Ukraine trying to fix their demographic problem through how demographics are actually fixed through repopulation. And so there is that aspect of why soldiers are given more time before they're drafted in Ukraine versus Russia. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about that tough and maybe somewhat disturbing question. Why is the United States trying to change this? Why is the U.S. putting pressure on Ukraine to lower the draft age to include 18-year-olds and not just 25-year-olds? Now, let's just say from the forefront, from a practical standpoint, seems like a pretty obvious solution. If Ukraine is low on soldiers, the most obvious thing to do is to use more Ukrainian men. And actually what it shows, the fact that Ukraine hasn't done this yet, in spite of US pressure, shows that Ukraine is not actually as desperate for men as everybody is always trying to make it seem. This war, of course, is existential for Ukraine. They are going to absolutely do everything that they have to do to ensure that they have the resources to continue fighting. And when it comes to pulling more men into the war, that is not an immediate decision. From the time that you pull men into the war, they actually have to be trained before they can even be used on the battlefield. And so the fact that Ukraine is continuing to be patient, as I've explained in other videos and other aspects, continuing to be patient before making the decision to start drafting younger Ukrainian men into the military, shows that their current position is actually stronger than a lot of people give them credit for. Why is the U.S. pressuring Ukraine to bring more men into the fight? Well, there is a perception that Ukraine's struggles on the battlefield are due primarily to manpower shortages. But Ukraine has repeatedly denied this, or at least caveated this. For Ukraine, the problem isn't really manpower so much as it is equipment. Now, they do have somewhat of a manpower problem, but the problem is that just drafting more men doesn't fix that problem, because it doesn't help if you draft men and don't have equipment to give them. This is a very Russian strategy if you want to take Russian tactics and just throw under-equipped men at positions and basically use them as meat shields to take positions. It is not the Ukrainian way of doing things. They do not send men into battle under-equipped. And so say what you will about Ukraine, and if they could do more, they've shown a lot of restraint in not making this decision. Now, what is a little bit disturbing about this whole thing, with the U.S. involvement and the U.S. pressure especially, to me as an American, is it shows the end result of years of political rhetoric within the United States against supporting the war in Ukraine. Because what we are seeing is that the U.S. is becoming so opposed to providing Ukraine with further financial support that they are, knowingly or not, trying to push Ukraine to adopt more diabolical military tactics. And ironically, they are trying to push Ukraine into taking the kinds of actions that arguably would make them less worthy of support if they had been taking them. We are basically saying we want Ukrainians to invest more of their lives because we are not willing to invest more of our money. And what it shows is that a lot of the anti-funding Ukraine rhetoric isn't actually about creating peace, and it's not actually about saving lives. It's actually about selfishly saving American dollars. Now, that's all I'll say about that. Let's pivot and let's close out this video by talking about one more important topic. One more important thing in this discussion about the difference between Ukrainian and Russian draft practices. You know, if you look on the internet or if you look in the comments of my videos, you won't be hard-pressed to find people talking about the evils of the Ukrainian draft police. And I'll be the first to admit that there are some disturbing videos out there where sometimes you will see Ukrainian military police doing some things that we find disturbing to collect men and force them into the military because they've been trying to dodge the draft. Russians in particular, they love to point to this as if there's nothing like that goes on in their countries. And the question we have to ask is, with all the things we've said, is Ukraine morally justified in doing this? And of course, this is a difficult topic, and it's actually one where there's not a clear yes or no. But what I will say is two things. First, there is a massive moral difference between conscripting people and forcing them to fight to attack another nation, like Russia is doing, and conscripting them and forcing them to fight to defend a nation, like Ukraine is doing. Just from the get-go, one is morally defensible, one is a lot more questionable. And any civilized country, if they were being attacked the way that Ukraine is being attacked and they needed more soldiers, they would do things similar to what Ukraine is doing. Now, it's also notable that these types of videos and occurrences are rare, and that when you do find things like this that happen that are rare, even if you find them disturbing, you have to realize that they are not representative of a nation as a whole. Sometimes, especially in nations like Ukraine, where there are almost 40 million people, believe it or not, there are people that carry out official duties that do so in a way that the country itself would not approve of. That happens in the United States all the time. There is no such thing as a military or a law enforcement organization that universally makes the right decisions 100% of the time. And so, while Russian propaganda will point to a lot of limited instances and make huge mountains out of molehills, I would definitely urge people to look at the situation as a whole rather than forming an opinion based on one or two video clips or one or two instances. So what we find in sum for this video is that Ukraine finds itself in a defensive war against Russia. War, unfortunately, requires conscription. It requires forcing people to fight who do not want to fight. But within conscription, there are different levels of approaches that you can take that show the comparative moral uprightness of the two sides on this conflict. And every decision that Ukraine has made, every policy that Ukraine has, shows that Ukraine, number one, is more morally upright than Russia in the way that they approach their task. And number two, that Ukraine is not as desperate as people often make them out to be. Now, don't misunderstand that. Ukraine needs all the support that they can get. But they are also not just going to lose to Russia tomorrow. Things are a lot more complex than that. Now, if you appreciate complexity, check out some of my other videos. And as you do so, can I ask you for a quick favor? If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something new, if you think that this is important, would you consider becoming a patron of this channel? I don't want you to feel pressured in any way whatsoever to do that. This is completely voluntary. It's just a way for people who want to support the channel to do so, and if I don't communicate it, people don't know about it. It's the only reason I talk about it. I'm super grateful for all the patrons who have already chosen to support this channel. Your support really does mean a lot to me. And so for those who may wish to become a patron and support this work and further videos like this, You can check that out in the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. Thanks again for watching, guys. Hope you learned something from this one. See you on the next one.